Well, I'd like to start just by introducing myself. I'm Professor Engelhardt, and when I think about kind of my own background with the Austrian School, um, there's a sense in which I kind of grew up in it, right? And that I went to Grove City College. I had professors. You might have heard of a couple of them. People like Herbner or Rittenauer were my professors there, right? So I've kind of grown up in the school. It is, in some sense, what I know. But nonetheless, I also like to interact with those outside the school as well, and I think that's part of where this lecture comes from. Now, when I first started as a faculty member here at Mises University, I would talk about, oh, it wasn't that long ago that I was a student sitting in these chairs. Um, that's not so plausible now that it was 22 years ago. So I'm sure many of you were busy being born and the like around then, if you had even moved that far in your life. Right? But nonetheless, it feels like it was not that long ago that I was sitting here in this room as a student actually hearing a lot of the same professors that you're hearing as well. Paul Swick being an exception. They didn't let him talk. Whether it was a good choice or not, I'll let you judge. In any case, my talk this morning is about game theory, an entrepreneurial twist. The reason that I'm giving this talk is because I enjoy game theory. There's really no deep reason here, except that when you think about game theory and some of the conclusions that are reached, and I hope to show this to you, it doesn't take full account of the fact that human beings are the ones playing these games, and that human beings are creative problem solvers, and as so, we will try to change games that look difficult or impossible to win. I certainly know this as I now have 4 children. The amount of times that rules change in games because they become too difficult is frequent. It seems to be inborn in humans. Okay. So first, I just want to establish that game theory is in fact part of praxeology, and this is the view of Murray Rothbard. He says in Man, Economy, and State, in the Appendix A of Chapter 1, he lays out a number of areas that he considers to be part of praxeology that are less developed, at least at the point in time that he was writing. He says, outside of economics, the rest of praxeology is an unexplored area. And then he makes the statement that a theory of games has been elaborated, very clearly stating that he believes the theory of games, or what we call game theory, is part of praxeology. And I think it'll be clear as we work through it that certainly we're looking at people that are forming goals, applying means to achieve those goals. So this is exactly what praxeology studies. Okay, so I'm going to start with a particular form of game, and this is really where most of our focus is going to be today, is looking at this form of game and kind of how it gets changed. That's the prisoner's dilemma. Okay. So the prisoner's dilemma is probably the most famous form of game that you'd find. People have heard of the prisoner's dilemma if you've heard of anything from game theory, and there is good reason for that, and reason that economists are interested in this. So we start with 2 people, we'll say Bonnie and Clyde. Right, so Bonnie and Clyde are performing various crimes together. Let's say they're robbing banks. To make it clear that they are in fact criminals, these are 100% reserve banks that they are robbing. Right, so eventually law enforcement catches up with them, and here I'm giving them a much happier ending than the true ending of their story. Law enforcement catches them and takes them into the station. This is, of course, private law enforcement, which we'll hear from Fegley about later. Right? So they separate them. One in one room, one in the other, and they offer them this deal. Right? And they say, we know you've been committing these rather serious crimes. Now, if you both confess, right, then we are in the upper left of this, we'll call it game matrix of this table. So you each get 5 years in prison because we have evidence of these serious crimes, but at the same time, you've engaged in a plea bargain. Right? On the other hand, if neither of you confess, we can't get you on the most serious crimes. We don't have strong enough evidence. However, we can get you on lesser crimes. Right? So you would still go to prison for 2 years apiece. Now, where things perhaps get more interesting is when one betrays the other. Right? So one stays faithful and the other one betrays. In that case, right, whoever's the one that confesses to the crime gets to go home today, because you helped us put your partner in crime away for a long time. Right? So whoever confesses gets 0 years. Well, the non-confessor, we have lots of evidence of serious crimes. They did not engage in a plea bargain. They get 10 years in prison. Right? So we have laid out here all the different possible outcomes. Now, the problem, of course, is Bonnie and Clyde, they don't really know what the other one's doing in the other room. So they have to try to reason through what the best thing is for they themselves to do. So let's think about Clyde first. Clyde says, well, okay, I don't know what Bonnie is doing next door. Maybe she's confessing. In that case, what are my options? Right? Well, if she's confessing, right, and I confess as well, I get 5 years in prison. If I don't confess, I get 10 years. I'm going to make the assumption less time in prison is better. That is, in fact, the preference that Clyde has. So, okay, in that case, I'm going to confess if I think that Bonnie's confessing. But maybe she's not. Maybe Bonnie is faithful and is not confessing. In that case, what should I do? Well, if I don't confess, I get 2 years in prison. But if I do confess, I get no years in prison. That sounds ideal, right? What's better than less time in prison is no time in prison, so that's what I'd want to do. Right? So we end up with Clyde reaching the conclusion that it really actually doesn't matter what Bonnie's doing next door in terms of what his best choice is. Right? His best choice is to confess regardless. Bonnie in the next room is going through the same line of reasoning, facing the same options, and therefore reaching the same conclusion. So we end up with this result, right? That both Bonnie and Clyde confess, right? And as a result, they get both put in prison for 5 years. So what makes this a prisoner's dilemma is 3 important traits. The first is we'd say there's one Nash equilibrium. That is this outcome that we worked through to predict. There's only one of those out there. There's not more than one that could potentially be stable, right? So one Nash equilibrium is one key element of it being a prisoner's dilemma. A second is that this Nash equilibrium is supported by what we call dominant strategies. That is where each player in this game says, it actually doesn't matter what the other one does. The best option for me is always the same. Right? So Clyde says, if she confesses, the best thing I can do is confess. If Bonnie doesn't confess, the best thing I can do is confess. Either way, the best thing I can do is confess. So that'd be a dominant strategy. Bonnie also has a dominant strategy. Now, these 2 are really important because it means that in this game, we have a very clear prediction. There's no, oh, maybe they'll end up here, maybe they'll end up there. And we know that they have a strong reason to do what they did, right? So it doesn't rely on Clyde figuring out what Bonnie is going to do, right? It doesn't matter what he thinks she's going to do. He's going to do the same thing. So it's not really that dependent on his ability to anticipate what the other does. Okay. All right. So this would be a prisoner's dilemma. And then there's a third trait. One Nash equilibrium, dominant strategies gives us a strong prediction. The third trait that makes this interesting to economists is that Nash equilibrium is, to use the technical phrase, not Pareto optimal. Okay. To use the less technical phrase, it's lousy. Right? This is not a good outcome. Right? Everybody here agrees, at least Bonnie and Clyde agree, they would rather not spend 5 years in prison apiece if 2 years in prison apiece is a possibility. And it was. Right? If neither of them confessed, that's what we'd end up with. The problem is, as soon as you think the other's not going to confess, you want to betray them. Right? So that's not where we end up. Right? So that's why prisoner's dilemmas are really interesting, because they give us the situation where each individual has a really good reason to do what they did. But then we end up with this outcome that is not very good. Right? So if you've seen the movie, it's not a new movie by any means at this point, A Beautiful Mind, this is where John Nash lays out this idea. Very frustratingly, the scene in that movie where he lays this out in a bar, what he describes is not in fact a prisoner's dilemma, but nonetheless, he's the one that came up with this idea and popularized it. So this can apply lots of other places. So it's not just in prisoners that we find this dilemma showing up. If that was the case, we probably wouldn't talk about it much. Okay. Right, so we also have the tragedy of the commons. Right, so here we have a case where there's some kind of common pool resource. The problem is if everybody tries to use it, it ends up getting eaten away. So the classic image here is we have like a medieval village and some common grazing ground in the middle of that village, and you can decide how much of your herd you want to graze there in that common ground. So we have Bonnie and Clyde here making the decision, do they use the commons or not? Well, if nobody uses the commons, then it stays pristine. Right? It's also basically useless, but at least it looks nice. Right? We would rather have things look nice than not look nice. On the other hand, if they both try to use the commons, it ends up devolving into a mud pit rather quickly. Right? So you have desolation, still not useful, but now also ugly. Right? Now, when one uses and the other doesn't, there happen to be enough resources in the commons that will support one of them grazing their cattle or sheep or whatever it happens to be in that area, but it would not support the other. So it's useful for whoever happens to use the thing. So what happens? Well, Clyde thinks through this and says, well, if Bonnie's using the commons and I don't, then it's just useless to me. Right? I could at least get some use out of it in the short run if I used it as well. Right? Of course, in the long run, that leads to desolation, but at least you get something in the process. Right? Meanwhile, if Bonnie doesn't use it, Clyde may as well use it. Otherwise, it's just useless to him. So he decides he's going to use the commons either way. Bonnie, facing the same situation, makes the same choice. And we end up, therefore, with the commons resulting in just desolation. This gets applied to things like overfishing in international waters and the like. And so we just see fish populations declining and the extinction of these species and the like. I suspect we'll hear more about this in particular from Dr. Terrell later when he talks about environmental conservation. Public goods would be another case. Right? So the problem with public goods, I was so excited. This was also probably like 22 years ago this movie came out. J.J. Abrams' Star Trek movie, the first one that he produced. There's this scene where there's a child Spock in the Vulcan school, and he says this phrase. He says, non-rivalry and non-excludability. I was so excited. Because non-rivalry and non-excludability are the two traits of what we call a public good. Right? So non-rivalry means that one person's use doesn't interfere with anybody else's. Right? So I can use the thing, you can also use the thing. We're not going to run out of it. Something that is rival would be something like a cheeseburger. Every bite I take of it, you can't take. Or something non-rival would be more like, say, the radio station. Right? We can all tune our radios to the same station. We're not getting in each other's way or using up the radio signal or anything like that. So it's non-rivalry. The second would be non-excludability. That is that it's difficult or impossible to prevent somebody from getting the benefit if they want it. So traditionally, we might talk about public goods, including things like lighthouses. Right? So a lighthouse shines its light across the ocean. It's non-rival. Any ship can see it and isn't blocking another ship from being able to see it. It's also non-excludable. Any ship that is within range is going to be able to see the thing. The problem with public goods is figuring out how to get them funded. After all, if you can use it without anybody being able to stop you, it's hard to charge you for the thing. And at the same time, it doesn't even feel like stealing because you're not preventing anybody else from taking the thing, right? So free riding becomes a potential problem. So we have Bonnie and Clyde here, right, trying to decide about funding this highway. So they have the choice. I'm going to say that the value they get from funding this highway is such that either of them would be willing to pay half the cost of funding it, but neither of them is willing to pay the full cost of funding it. Right, so if they both decide to fund, we end up then in the lower right, we have say beautiful highways. We might want to say now big, beautiful byways. That's more poetic, right? For everybody. And we split the cost in some sense fairly. That is that everybody thinks they're benefiting more than the cost they pay. However, if everybody tries to free ride, we end up with the issue of course, who will build the roads? It's the classic case of I say, if everyone tries to free ride, nobody buys a car, right? So we don't get anywhere. That's the issue. Now, if one free rides and the other doesn't, whoever free rides gets pure benefit, has no cost at all. They can use this road. Nobody can stop them from doing it. At the same time, whoever funds the thing, well, they don't have pure cost. They certainly have cost beyond what they would have been willing to pay themselves. All right, so what do? Clyde says, well, if Bonnie's going to free ride, I'm certainly going to free ride as well. I don't want to foot the whole bill for this thing. At the same time, if Bonnie funds it, I would much rather just get the benefit and not share the cost. Right? Bonnie, same reasoning, same conclusion. We end up with the issue of who will build the roads. Despite the fact, again, Bonnie and Clyde agree, right, big, beautiful byways for all, right, would be more beneficial. Okay. All right, but nonetheless, here's where we are, stuck in this Nash equilibrium that is not beneficial, lousy. Okay. All right. Now, it turns out we do actually have answers to who will build the roads. The answer is Domino's Pizza. Okay. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I'm sure you can find on Google Domino's Pizza potholes. There was a point in time where they had this campaign. Okay. All right. And it makes sense. If you're delivering pizza on a regular basis, you want the roads to be in reasonable shape. Okay. All right. This one comes from some reasoning you'll find in John Maynard Keynes and the way that he talks about how depressions can be very long-lasting and you can get stuck in them. So this is a form of depression trap. So Bonnie and Clyde here are no longer criminals. Now they're entrepreneurs. Right? And they're trying to decide, right, how to pay their workers. Now they have the choice of either keeping their wages relatively low, right, or of increasing their wages. Now, Keynes would make the argument, if everybody keeps wages low, then nobody really has excess money to spend, and the economy stays depressed. On the other hand, if everybody increases their wages, then we get this nice Keynesian multiplier effect. Oh, I have more money, so I'll go out and spend. That stimulates other businesses. They go out and spend, and we have this whole process that goes on according to the Keynesian framework. So we have an economic expansion if only everybody will pay their workers more. Now, when things mix, say Clyde keeps his wages low while Bonnie increases hers, we have this problem that now Bonnie's costs have gone up, but she's getting very little of the benefit from that. Okay, her workers are paid more. They might buy a little bit more of the product she produces, but a lot of the benefit is going to go to Clyde and whatever he's producing. Right, so he gets pure profit from this, from the increase in revenue from Bonnie's workers that are now buying more of his stuff, while his costs stay low. So what does he do? Well, if in the case where Bonnie keeps wages low, he could have pure cost by increasing his wages, or ultimately end up with a depression if he doesn't, but he doesn't want to have pure cost. At the same time, he has pure profit if he keeps wages low and Bonnie increases her wages. He keeps wages low, as does Bonnie. And we end up stuck in this depression. If only we could all arrange to increase our wages, we could move into this expansion, we'd have great prosperity. That's all it would take, right, according to this reasoning. Or something that has been more in the news recently, which we also heard Dr. Patrick Newman talk about, things like tariffs and protectionism. So here we have, I guess it's Clyde Land, right, and Bonavia, right, trying to decide what their trade policy is going to look like. Are they going to have tariffs or free trade toward the other? Well, they could both have tariffs, in which case, right, they are protecting, right, their national industry from competition from abroad. Of course, we know the side effect of this is economic disintegration in a very literal sense, and that our economies are not as integrated as they would otherwise be. Right? Or we could both have free trade and have competition internationally, but also the division of labor internationally, which would benefit us in terms of productivity. On the other hand, if we have tariffs and you have free trade, say I'm Clyde Land, right? In that case, our industry feels nice and protected. They don't have to face so much competition here at home. Plus, we have access, right, to foreign markets. Right? Certainly, our exporters are happy with this as well. Meanwhile, Bonavia's industries have to face this competition from abroad, which does not feel so attractive. What happens? Well, Clyde Land says, if you're going to have tariffs, well, then I should have reciprocal tariffs against you. After all, otherwise we're a victim of these bad trade deals. Right? Meanwhile, if Bonavia has free trade, Clyde Land says, well, we can protect our industries. This is going to be a great deal, right, for us here. Right? So we end up bragging about making these types of trade deals where, yeah, they're lowering all of their tariffs against us, but we've raised our tariffs on them. This is fantastic for our people, being the specific people that benefit from the tariffs. Right? All right, and that is the conclusion that Clyde Land reaches. Bonavia reaches the same conclusion, and we therefore end up with economic disintegration and national monopolies. Okay. Despite the fact that we know we would be better off, certainly in terms of productivity, if we had full free trade. So this is a lot of different applications. All of these have that prisoner dilemma kind of setup. Right? It has all kinds of applications out there. And also, this is not just in economics. You find game theory and specifically the prisoner's dilemma show up in other fields as well. Right? So rather famously, you see it used for things like should we engage in nuclear disarmament or something like that, and these kinds of political choices. And even this past spring, I was on a committee that was evaluating people for a teaching award. I observed a class in biology. It was evolutionary biology, and he was laying out this game theoretic argument for whether you'd have a species that would act more kind of groupishly or whether it would act more individualistically. It's kind of interesting. It's certainly a multidisciplinary subject. So what are the typical conclusions then with these types of cases? Right? So we know in prisoners' dilemmas, that specific type of game that we've been looking at, people are choosing optimally from an individual perspective. Nonetheless, we get bad outcomes from the broader social perspective. Right? So naturally, we need some kind of authority or government to step in and do things like enforce trade agreements. This would be the role that the World Trade Organization is supposed to play, right? Making sure that we all have free trade with each other, allow people to punish each other or countries to punish each other if we don't. We need to force wages up in depression, so have things like minimum wage laws be put in place. Oh, we've heard something about minimum wage laws this week. Or we need to make sure we have public goods being funded with taxes, and even the people paying the taxes will feel like they're better off because they're willing to chip in as long as they only have to chip in and not cover the full cost. Right? We need to regulate the use of the commons, make sure that we don't have it devolve into mud pits. We need to make sure prisoners don't confess and end up with Okay, maybe that one we don't want to worry about. Right. But nonetheless, these are the types of arguments we see in how individual action leads to this collective outcome that we don't like. Right? So it's used time and time again as justification, right, for state action. And I want to suggest that if we take just a little dose of an entrepreneurial mindset and think what entrepreneurship means, right, from an Austrian perspective, how that can change, right, these types of situations. So two different views of entrepreneurship that I'm going to be pulling from here. Right? Mises, in the way that he describes entrepreneurs and successful entrepreneurs and what characterizes them, while entrepreneurship itself is this acting under uncertainty, the successful entrepreneur is the one that has the keen foresight, right, in figuring out what is it, say in the case of business, what do consumers actually want? What are they actually willing to pay for, right, so that I can operate profitably. Right? So that is really the key Mises with its foresight, seeing what the future would bring and acting accordingly. Then Kerzner suggests that really entrepreneurship is about seizing opportunities. There are these opportunities that exist out there, and some people can see them, some people cannot. But yeah, I'm getting old. Like even with my glasses on, my eyes don't adjust like they used to, and it's very frustrating. It's like I'll be driving down the street, like I should be able to read that street sign, but I can't till I get close enough because my eyes just won't adjust like they used to. And I go to the doctor, and he says, "Oh no, your prescription's fine." I'm like, "Oh, I'm just old, right?" I don't have the alertness that I used to because my sight isn't that good, right? But a good Kerznerian entrepreneur, right, has that alertness, has the ability to see these opportunities and seize these opportunities, right? So what makes an entrepreneur successful if we combine these two? You have to have keen foresight and then seize those opportunities that arise. You're alert to them as they show up, right? So what does this mean then for something like a prisoner's dilemma? Well, I would suggest that an entrepreneur does not just declare the game lost. That is, well, I guess we're just both going to confess and end up with 5 years in prison. Rather, entrepreneurs, because of their foresight, can seize opportunities to change the game. Right? So entrepreneurs, in the role they play, right, can be game changers. Right? Now, we already know, if you study more advanced courses in game theory, there are a number of solutions to things like prisoner's dilemmas. Right? Something like if you repeat the game over and over, that is something that can change the outcome. Because once I know I'm going to be playing the same game again, that brings up the possibility of reward and punishment. Right? So I'm going to want to reward good behavior in the future and punish it in the future. As I know my partner is going to want to do the same, that makes me more inclined, right, then to behave well. Right? So we know that these solutions exist. The question is, will entrepreneurs actually make them happen? I suggest the answer is yes. Yes. All right. So the key assumption, right, as we're re-envisioning game theory, the key assumption we had previously made is the game is fixed. But once we add entrepreneurs to the mix, this is often not the case. Right? You can change the game. So that suggests that from a theoretical perspective, we need to ask the right question. That is, how might entrepreneurs try to improve the game? Right? And if they're not improving the game, what is the barrier preventing that from happening? After all of these cases, we know there's a better outcome out there. The question is, why don't we reach it? Why isn't there something happening that is going to make this end up better than we thought? Right? So it might be, sometimes there are hidden costs involved we don't realize. Right? So once we account for those hidden costs, it turns out maybe things that we thought looked good didn't look so good. I have often, when I teach principles of microeconomics and I'm talking about prisoner's dilemmas, I'll set up a prisoner's dilemma kind of framework. I'll have students play it for candy, that kind of things, playing for Snickers bars, that kind of, and the like. And I will occasionally have students that will volunteer and will play through the game, and they don't play the predicted outcome. Right? Whenever that happens, which I will say is probably more often than not, I say, okay, so why didn't you, in effect, play the confess? And sometimes students will say, oh, I don't really like Snickers bars. Right? Now, that's clearly an irrational preference as far as that goes. But that suggests that I got the game wrong in the first place. I was assuming that more Snickers bars would be attractive, so you'd want to betray the other person to try to get that additional Snicker bar and make sure you didn't end up with nothing. Nonetheless, if you don't care about Snicker bars or actively dislike them, you're going to change your behavior. Right? So sometimes there are elements here that we have missed, so perhaps hidden costs or hidden benefits. And sometimes there's some kind of rule that's preventing us from actually being able to achieve this better outcome. So I want to give kind of a few examples then of using game theory in some sense what I would call wrong. Here we can look at the previous examples. So if we just reach the conclusion that, oh, because we're going to end up stuck with a depression, we need to have minimum wages to push us out of it and lead to economic expansion, that's making the assumption that we're not going to come up with some other private solution. Similarly, with tragedies of the commons and public goods, we're just assuming that there's no possible way that creative people could solve these problems and end up with a better outcome. I would also suggest, though, that Austrian economists are not immune to this type of trap, where we fall into using game theory and kind of taking it at face value, ignoring entrepreneurship and how entrepreneurs would approach the game if they see it coming. Here there is a very good paper by Curley and Dempster. So this is related to business cycle theory, which is one of my significant interests. And specifically the question of, with business cycle theory, there's kind of this funny thing that Brian Kaplan points out in the way that Austrians talk about it. Where on the one hand, when we talk about entrepreneurs are really, really good at anticipating the future and acting accordingly. But then it seems like we're all stupid, right, during the boom in the business cycle. We make all these malinvestments, right? These clusters of errors, right, that Dr. Swick talked about. So why is it that people who are normally really, really good, right, at seeing the future, why don't they see the boom coming? Right? Now, of course, there is some realities that we're being lied to, after all. But there's also an additional argument that Curley and Dempster flesh out, which suggests that there's a game theoretic problem here. So let me give their argument. Right, so we're thinking about investment during the boom phase of the business cycle. That is, do you want to increase investment, making use of these additional credit expanded funds or not? Would you rather just maintain investment? Okay. So here we have just firm X is going to be our representative firm, right, thinking through this, and then we'll have all other firms are also making this choice as well. Right, so you can either, right, increase your investment, take advantage of the low interest rates and the like, or you could not maintain your investment. Okay. Now, if we maintain investment, we end up in the lower right. That is, where our relative profits, whether you mean, are going to be the same for all of these firms because you're all making the same choice. And at the same time, we wouldn't have the boom bust happen, where we just kind of keep acting as if this credit expansion did not occur. Right? We have the resources to do what we were doing, so we're going to be okay. On the other hand, if we both increase investment, then our relative profits still stay the same. Right? We're all making the same choice, so our profits will match, but we now have the boom bust cycle, because it isn't, in fact, possible for us to increase investment and carry these investments to completion because of resource availability. Right, so we have then, what about the mixed cases? Well, suppose with firm X, right, that they increase investment while all the other firms maintain their investment. Well, in that case, there are profits to be made. After all, interest rates are lower than before. You can make these investments more profitably, right? So let's increase investment and earn a greater profit than anyone else. On the other hand, if I just maintain my investment while everyone else increases, my profits fall behind what everybody else's would be. Right? So firm X says, well, if everybody else increases investment and I don't, I end up lagging behind in profit, so I should increase investment and match what they're doing. On the other hand, if everybody else maintains investment, then I should take advantage of this opportunity and increase investment to earn a greater profit than anyone else. Right? So dominant strategy, let's increase investment, and every single firm, it is after all firm X, fill in the X with whatever name you want, and we reach the same conclusion. So we end up stuck with the boom-bust cycle. Okay. So what's wrong, right, with this line of reasoning? I think there are a few things. So this is actually part of a paper that I wrote, also trying to answer this question, why do entrepreneurs end up making these mistakes? Yeah, if you want to look that up, I'm trying to remember the exact name of it. It's the elements of it, it's credit expansion and entrepreneurial quality. It's one of my early papers. I think I wrote it like 12 years ago or something like that. In any case, first is there's this odd short-term perspective, right? And that if we're still assuming that these are rational entrepreneurs with good foresight, they know these investments, at least a good chunk of them, are just going to fail, right? So why aren't we taking into account that these relative profits being the same, they're going to be really bad, right, in the future, right? So it's not, in fact, exactly the same in the upper left as in the lower right, this relative profits being equal. You actually can avoid some losses in the lower right versus the upper left. Also, it seems odd to me that we're worried about relative profit rather than absolute profit, right? So I'm imagining, say, somebody came into this room and said, okay, everybody give me $20, you all shell out $20, and they point to me and say, no, you only give me $2, right? I'm not rejoicing that I'm better off. I may be relieved that I'm not as worse off as the rest of you, right? But I'm not so worried about the relative profit because I still lost something, right? Okay, so that also struck me as weird. But in terms of the game theory, I think the real problem is they're not asking the right question. What are they doing? Right? The real question is, why don't firms organize, right, to prevent this increased investment, which will hurt them all in the long run? There's some kind of barrier there that is preventing this organization from happening. Okay. And I think that is a very productive line to think along. So what about using game theory right from this sort of perspective? That is taking entrepreneurs into account, right? So in this case, I think that game theory can inform, right, when entrepreneurs are going to have to seek out creative institutional solutions to these kinds of nasty problems, right? So my favorite, perhaps somewhat silly example of this is split or steal. Right? So this is from a British game show that was on several years ago called Golden Balls. I know very little about this game show and what actually happens in it throughout most of it, except that I know at the end, the last thing that the players do, you have two players, And they play a game called split or steal, and it has this structure. Right? So over the course of the game, they've accumulated some kind of pot of money. In the case of Ibrahim and Nick, it was 50,000 pounds was what they had accumulated over the course of the game. Right? And then each of them is given a golden ball, which when you open it up, it has either the word split or the word steal there. And then they can choose which of these two balls they're going to reveal as the play that they have made. And here's what the payoffs look like. Right? So if both of them play split, then that's exactly what happens. Right? They take the 50,000 pounds, they split it, they each get 25,000, they walk away, in effect, having won. If they both play steal, though, then the network is who wins because nobody gets anything. They walk away empty-handed. Now, if one plays split and the other plays steal, whoever plays steal gets the entire prize. Whoever played split gets nothing. Right? So let's reason through the game. So Nick says, well, if Ibrahim plays steal, then it really doesn't matter what I do. Right? I get nothing. If I play steal, I also get nothing. If I play split, I get nothing because Ibrahim takes it all. Meanwhile, if Ibrahim's playing split, right, then I can get 50,000 by playing steal, only 25,000 by playing split. Right? So we do in fact have some reason to play steal, no real reason to choose split over steal in any particular case. Right? And Ibrahim, reasoning through, reaches the same conclusion. Now I will say here, this is not quite a prisoner's dilemma. And the way we would describe steal here as a strategy for them is that it's not quite a dominant strategy. It's what we call a weakly dominant strategy. That is, you have some reason to play it, but it's not always obviously the best answer, right? So if Ibrahim plays steal, for Nick, it really doesn't matter what he does, right? So that keeps this from being a strictly dominant strategy and makes it only a weakly dominant strategy. Nonetheless, right, technicalities aside, if we're trying to predict what they're going to do, each of them have a reason to play steal. You never have a reason you should play split over steal, right? So we should see everybody steal, right? At which point the network wins the game. Okay. All right. So it turns out in this particular case with Nick and Ibrahim, Nick was entrepreneurial. Right? He was very clear. He knew how this game was played. He knew that they were going to be ending with split or steal, so he had a plan. Right? He didn't come in and just say, oh no, what can I possibly do? I guess I'm going to play steal, and then the network is happy. Right? Instead, here's what Nick did. He said, now, unlike Bonnie and Clyde, Nick and Ibrahim, it would make very bad television to say we're just separating these people and you're going to watch them think. Right? No, instead we let them talk to each other. Right? So they're going to talk to each other. The way this typically goes, you can find these kinds of clips on YouTube, is them saying, oh, you know I'm an honest person. I'm definitely going to play split. My family would kill me if I don't play split, all this kind of stuff. Right? And then ultimately somebody betrays the other. Right? Nick was very different. And he said, I'm an honest person. I'm a man of my word. I'm going to play steal. But here's what's going to happen. When I play steal, if you play split, I will split the money with you, right? So he changed the outcome of the game that is possible, right? So what did he just do? So analyzing it from Nick's perspective, he said, I'm going to play steal, but then I offer this deal where you see in the bold in the upper right. So if Ibrahim plays steal, it doesn't matter what happens in terms of Nick's choice, right? Nick is going to get zero either way, right? If Ibrahim plays split, again, Nick walks away with 25,000. Right. So as long as Nick is willing to follow through on this splitting after he gets everything. Now, I wonder, I don't know how the case law works, whether this would be considered a verbal contract or not. Maybe not. The context might prevent that. But if so, this might possibly be enforceable, right? So that's an interesting thing. In any case, right? So again, Nick, it doesn't really matter what he does as long as he is willing to commit to that split. As long as Ibrahim plays split, the money ends up split. Right, so Nick just got rid of his reason, right, to play steal over split, which is interesting given his commitment. But what did he do to Ibrahim? Well, Ibrahim now says, well, if I think Nick is telling the truth, in that case, he's going to play steal. If I play steal, I get nothing. If I play split, I at least get the half that he gives me. Right? Meanwhile, if Nick plays split and I play steal, right, then I can get all of it. But if I play split, I get half, right? So now Ibrahim gets divided, right? If he thinks that Nick is lying to him and is in fact going to play split, then he should play steal and take the whole thing, right? If on the other hand, he believes that Nick is going to play steal and then split the money, right? He should in fact play split. It's kind of a weird thing that he's done, right? So now Ibrahim doesn't know what to do, right? And interestingly, when you watch his reaction, he's like, you are insane. You're insane, right? because it feels really weird that somebody would go on national television and say, I'm a good, honest person, I'm going to take all the money. But it's kind of an odd thing to do. You're insane. Right? But nonetheless, what would we predict would happen in this case? Well, it does seem like Nick, after all, he has no reason to lie about this. Right? But as long as he's willing to follow through on that second part of the deal and split the money, right, he may as well do what he said. And if, in fact, we believe him, then Abraham may as well go ahead and play split, and we should end up here. Right? Now, it turns out this is not what happened. Instead, what happened was the lower right. Because after all, Nick just made it so that it didn't matter whether he played steal or split. So he went ahead and played split. So it turns out Nick is a liar. But because he's a liar, they both walked away having won the game rather than having lost the game. Right? It's kind of wild. All right. So what did he do? He took an entrepreneurial approach. He knew the game was coming. He made a strategy, this creative option for what he could do to change the game and change the incentives, therefore, that his opponent was facing. And they ended up with a cooperative outcome. We also see this in perhaps less silly examples, like Huerta de Soto, in the way that he uses game theory in his book, Money, Bank Credit and Business Cycles, or Economic Cycles, when he talks about credit expansion on page 667. Okay. So he lays out a game like this. Right? So we're trying to understand why it is that banks would engage in the credit expansion process, given that it tends not to go very well. Right? So we have this situation. So Bank A and Bank B each have the choice of either not expanding or expanding. Now, if neither of them expand, they both survive and they earn a small profit. If both expand, then they can earn significantly more profit, and they also both survive. As long as you're expanding at basically the same rates, then you don't have to worry about any clearing going against you or anything like that. Now, you run into problems, however, if you expand and the other one doesn't. In that case, you end up losing your reserves as adverse clearing happens, and your bank fails if you're the expansionary one, while the other bank that did not expand survives. So walking through the process, Bank A says, well, if Bank B doesn't expand, and I do, I'm going to fail. I don't want to do that, right? So I will go ahead and not expand either. Right? Meanwhile, if Bank B does expand, I can earn a large profit by expanding. So I want to expand as well. Right? So we now have, this is definitely not a prisoner's dilemma, that's not a dominant strategy, but there's this incentive to try to match, right, what the other one is doing. And of course, Bank B faces the same situation, therefore makes the same decision, and we end up with this. Right, so looking at our arrows, another reason we know this is not a prisoner's dilemma, we actually have two Nash equilibria. Right, so that is, if one doesn't expand, the other doesn't want to expand, and that would be stable. There's no reason for us to start expanding here, or your bank's going to fail. Right? On the other hand, right, if both of us are expanding, there's no reason for me to stop expanding, because then I'm just giving up the large profit that I'm earning. Right? So either one of these outcomes would be stable. Right, so what does Huerta de Soto do, right, with this game? We also have a name for this. This is called a coordination game. Right, so lots of things fall under this. Things like, what side of the street do you drive on? Doesn't much matter whether it's the right or the left, as long as you do what everyone else in your country is doing. If you don't do what everyone else in your country is doing, you have serious problems, right? Okay. All right, and the same kind of thing happens here. It doesn't much matter whether we expand or not, right? As long as we do what everyone else is doing, we're okay. That's the ultimate goal. Now, we would rather all expand than not all expand. So we want to try to coordinate to make that happen. And that is exactly the conclusion that de Soto reaches. So de Soto says, well, in this situation, prudent bankers that are worried about failure are not going to expand. Less prudent bankers who are more tempted by those large profits would expand. But every single banker has an incentive to try to coordinate to make sure credit expansion happens. So bankers push for central banks that are going to be willing to bail out if things go wrong. So in other words, they change the game to something like this. Right? So what happens here? So if both don't expand, if both expand, it's the same as before, but we've now changed what happens if one expands and the other doesn't. Specifically, if you would fail, instead of the failure happening, you get bailed out, which means you still earn a small profit. So looking at this, Bank A says, well, if Bank B does not expand and I don't expand, I get a small profit and survive. If I expand, okay, I would have failed, but I still get a small profit because I get bailed out by the central bank. Right? So small profit either way. It doesn't much matter what I do if they're not expanding. On the other hand, if they are expanding, I can either just survive by not expanding, or I can earn a large profit by expanding as well. So I have a good reason to expand, no reason not to, and the same thing happens with Bank B, with the result being now we only have one Nash equilibrium where we're all expanding and we end up earning large profits. So notice here what de Soto did, right? He didn't just take the game as given. He said, this game offers these two opportunities. One of them is clearly better than the other, So what bankers are going to do is recognize that and then change the rules of the game so that they end up with a more beneficial outcome. Okay. Now, there are a number of other ways that we know that we can solve these games. Game theorists have talked about this. So I already mentioned in the case of a prisoner's dilemma, things like repeating the game can help, right? So I might see partners in crime arise, right? So if I know that I'm going to be facing this choice of, do I betray you or do I not? And then that's going to happen again and again and again. I want to make sure I'm very faithful because I don't want you to betray me next time the chance arises, right? We also have the possibility of having some kind of enforcers, right? So I like to call that breaking the confessor's kneecaps, right? So sure, maybe you're not in prison, but you're in the hospital instead, okay? All right. Or the tragedy of the commons, right? We know that there are options for solving this, right? So things like privatizing them tends to work really, really well. We find that with things like elephant populations, right? So we have countries with elephant poaching issues, those countries that have taken the view that we're going to allow people to own elephants and effectively treat them as ranch animals, find their elephant populations recover and expand. Right? Take this thing that was sitting out in the commons, the only way you can own it is by poaching it, turn it into a ranch animal, and suddenly people take care of it. Okay. This shouldn't be that shocking. People take care of the things they own. Right? Or we also have, perhaps somewhat less extremely, Eleanor Ostrom's work on managing the commons, right? So in cases where it might be more difficult to privatize, as long as we realize this might be a problem, we start developing rules around them and find ways naturally from the bottom up to create ways of managing them to make sure we don't have desolation. So that's, and if anything, the mystery of the commons, right, is that there are all these cases that tragedy should happen that it doesn't happen, right? Which I think was really what inspired Ostrom's work and say, okay, why don't we see this tragedy occurring time and time again? It turns out people are really good at self-organizing and solving these problems. Or something like public goods, right? So things like developing matching funds, right, is something that can be very effective. Several years ago, Reading Rainbow was a program that was on PBS when I was a kid and when many people were kids. It was on for decades, I'm pretty sure. And then they wanted to develop this app that they would offer for free, right, to everyone. Right, so this, okay, non-rivalry, non-excludability is happening here. Right? How are we possibly going to fund this thing? Well, we go to Kickstarter, say, here's our project, right? If you're willing to chip in a few dollars, right, we'll have the project happen if we hit whatever the required amount is. It raised millions of dollars very quickly because people are willing to chip in to make sure this project happen, right? So we have solutions. Okay. All right, if it's not, in fact, we're stuck with no one building the roads, nobody has the Reading Rainbow app. No, we solve the problem and we do so creatively. Right, so some conclusions here. So I think when we think about game theory, often we find game theorists are tempted by what I would call game theory the wrong way. That is, we say, oh, we end up with these lousy outcomes from individual choice. So the clear solution is to eliminate individual choice. Let's force the good outcome on people. Or I think the right way is to take into account that people are in fact people, and part of being people is being creative. Specifically that class of people we'd call entrepreneurs, have this mindset, have this ability to foresee when these problems are going to arise, have the ability to find solutions to them. And we don't need everybody to do this, right? We just need a big enough group to come up with an answer that people recognize as being a reasonable answer. Right? So I think using game theory the right way, the questions we start asking is, what are entrepreneurs doing to fix these problems? And if they're not, what's standing in the way? Thank you. I think we have a 15-minute, 16-minute break or so.